Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we're here in Southern California, getting ready for the 2019 Reagan National Defense Forum. This week, we're going to look at the troubled waters faced by new Navy leadership and visit London for the 2019 NATO Summit. With in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis, this is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin here in Agora Hills, California, as we get ready for this year's Reagan National Defense Forum. But before we discuss this year's event, we've got a lot to dig into. Let's get started. The United States Navy has formally awarded the largest ever shipbuilding contract, awarding a $22 billion deal to General Dynamics Electric Boat for up to 10 Block V Virginia-class submarines, 8 of which are going to have the new Virginia payload module. The work will be split with Newport News Naval Shipbuilding, with 6 being built there and 4 at Electric Boat. Now that's because GD is hard at work on the first Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, expected to eat up much of their focus. And starting next year, U.S. Air Force F-35 pilots are going to be able to jump in a simulator and practice large-scale operations with F-35A pilots around the globe. The capability, known as Distributed Mission Technology, will allow an unlimited amount of simulators to be networked. Now, the first customer is set to be U.S. Air Force aircraft at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, and in the future, the sims are going to be able to connect with other aircraft sims like the F-22, F-16, and E-3 AWACS. Additionally, the UK, as well as the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, are set to get this new tech. And budget gridlock is putting the future of the new Space Development Agency at risk. At least that's according to Undersecretary of Defense Mike Griffin. Since the Pentagon is currently under a continuing resolution, the SDA has been unable to ramp it up, as it expected to do in this fiscal year. Griffin said he sees a lot of agreement that space capabilities need work, but no consensus on when a budget is going to come. And if Congress can't approve a 2020 budget by the end of December, the U.S. Army will likely seek an exemption that will allow the Synthetic Training Environment Program, or STE, to proceed on schedule. That's according to Major General Maria Gervais, who leads the Army's cross-functional team for that program. Gervais says a CR would end many OTA agreements in early February or March, which could cause great damage to STE, halting much of the work that they've been working on. And the Army has also awarded an $11 million contract to a team made up of Rheinmetall and Unified Business Technologies for testing of the Strike Shield Active Protection System at Redstone Arsenal down in Alabama, starting next October. Strike Shield is designed to protect armored vehicles from rockets, missiles, and other threats. The testing is expected to inform the Army's plans for protecting new armored vehicles such as the OMFV, or Mobile Protected Firepower, that are set to enter the force in the 2020s. And the Navy's Japan-based 7th Fleet is getting a plus-up to its amphibious force as the USS New Orleans pulled into Sasebo Naval Base recently. The New Orleans is set to be joined by the USS America, which would raise the total ships deployed there from 5 from the current 3. They'll augment the USS Green Bay, the USS Ashland, and the USS Germantown as the Navy's only permanently forward-deployed amphibious force. Now this comes as the United States is shifting more forces to the Pacific as part of a focus on China. And this week was a big week for NATO, as the alliance gathered in London to celebrate its 70th anniversary. And there was certainly a lot to discuss, especially as many of the leaders have had a lot to say about NATO recently. Here's some highlights.
It's a tough statement, though, when you make a statement like that. That is a very, very nasty statement to essentially 28, including them, 28 countries. I think that, you have a very high unemployment rate in France. France is not doing well economically at all. They're starting to tax other people's products, so therefore, we go and tax them. It's just taking place right now on technology, and we're doing their wines and everything else. And it's a very tough statement to make when you have such difficulty in France. You look at what's happened with the yellow vests, or you look at what's going on during certain parts of their season. They've had a very rough year. And you just can't go around making statements like that about NATO. It's very disrespectful.
It was agreed amongst all of us that 70 years after its foundation here in London, it is absolutely true to say that NATO is the most successful alliance in history. And everybody also attested to the fundamental reason for the success of that alliance, and it is based on the idea of solidarity in defense of our values of freedom and democracy, the basic idea of all for one and one for all, encapsulated in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, that we come to each other's mutual defense. That's why NATO works, and that's why it's so powerful and so successful.
We are also modernizing this alliance, responding to new challenges in cyber, in space. We will declare space as a new operational domain for NATO, something we never had before. So it just highlights that, well, there are differences because we are 29 different countries from both sides of the Atlantic with different political parties in power, with different history, different geography. But despite these differences, we have always been able to unite around our core task to protect and defend each other because we are stronger and safer together. And I'm absolutely certain that will also be the case now.
One thing announced before the summit was upgrades to NATO's fleet of E-3 airborne warning and control aircraft based in Germany. According to Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the alliance's 16 aircraft will be upgraded and will serve into the 2030s before retiring. Here's what he had to say when announcing the upgrades.
This is just one example of how NATO is modernizing, and this is something which has been planned for a while. The fact that we are able now to announce this contract. NATO is adapting, NATO is agile, NATO is active, and the modernization of the AWACS aircraft is demonstrating the agility and the strength of NATO. For me, this is part of a pattern we have seen, part of a greater adaptation of NATO, which has been ongoing for a long time. We are implementing the largest reinforcement, the largest modernization of our alliance in a generation. And this modernization of the AWACS is one example of that. We have plans in place to defend and protect all allies, and our commitment to our collective defense clause is ironclad. And not only do we have plans, but we actually have more ready forces, a modernized command structure, and more modern capabilities than we had for decades. We have plans, but also the capabilities to protect all NATO allies. And again, the new modern AWACS aircraft is one part of that. And the AWACS modernization doesn't only show that NATO is modernizing, but it also demonstrates that North America and Europe are doing things together, because this is actually about bringing both the countries from both sides of the Atlantic together, but also industry from both North America and Europe together, and providing cutting-edge new capabilities as part of the modernization program for AWACS, a lot of new equipment into those planes. The planes have been there for a long time, but the equipment, the capabilities are cutting-edge, extremely modern capabilities.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. Now, when we come back, we're going to look at the state of the U.S. Navy as they face leadership changes and a challenging few years ahead of them. After the very public firing of former Secretary Richard Spencer, the Navy is at a crossroads. So what's going on within the service and what's ahead? To find out, I chatted with Naval Warfare reporter Dave Larder to get his take. So Dave, it's safe to say the Navy's had a weird couple of weeks. Losing a secretary, these judicial problems. Kind of what's your take on what actually happened with all the weird stories we kind of heard?
Right, so it's been more like a weird few years for the Navy, and this is sort of the latest iteration of weirdness. The Secretary of the Navy was fired by Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, ostensibly because he was apparently went behind Secretary Esper's back and made a deal with the president to allow this Navy SEAL, who's been at the center of a war crimes trial, retire with his Trident pin. And this had been something that the president had gotten into on Twitter, and it had made it a politically loaded case. And I think Secretary Esper probably felt like the Secretary of the Navy going behind his back and doing a deal with the president, despite what he was saying publicly, caused a lot of tension to result essentially in his termination as Secretary of the Navy. Now, the Secretary has a different version of this story, but ultimately it seems to boil down to that decision.
Dave, looking at this, where does the Navy kind of go from here? They very publicly had a Secretary of the Navy just spiral out and destroy himself in the national stage. So what does the Navy do from here leadership-wise with all the many things that they're having problems doing?
Right, and so Spencer, it should be clear that Spencer was probably fired for what they say he was fired for the going behind his back, the Mark Esper's back. But we also need to keep in mind that he was having issues before. He had made a promise to the president that the Ford class would be ready to go this summer, and then it turned out that he claimed he wasn't being told the full story by Huntington Ingalls, and the Ford class is now going to be much, much later than this summer. So publicly staking his reputation on this promise to the president did not help his standing, and it's certainly something that the president alluded to in his tweet, being unhappy with contracting issues. So he was already not in a great position, and then this happened. So where does it go from here? Well, they've got a nominee in mind, and my colleague Joe Gould had put together a very nice profile of him. He's a staunch Trump ally. He's a former public affairs officer in the Navy, former two-star.
That could be good for us on the media side.
It could be good. He would certainly understand the importance and the way the media works. But he doesn't have a ton of sort of operational experience that you would expect from a non-traditional sort of picked from the Admiralty pick to lead the Navy Department. Obviously, the big deal with Mattis was, well, he's this four-star and he's got this unique position and unique view of the Defense Department. Maybe he could bring something to that position. And it's not necessarily the same deal with Braithwaite, but what I would say is that he's not just an admiral. He's current ambassador to Norway, so he'll have experience outside the Navy lifelines and hopefully have some ideas when he comes into the door, not just from his Navy background, but also from his time in the private sector and now in the diplomatic sector. You
mentioned it there, kind of talking about one of the reasons that it appears that one of the, not the primary reason, but a secondary reason for Spencer leaving was acquisition problems with the Navy. Like massive programs that are either delayed or kind of on the precipice of failing or being even more delayed than they should be when they were already no-fail programs. Do you see a new SecNav being able to kind of get things back on track, or is it just too early to tell?
I think it's a little early to tell. Now, there are good things happening too. JFK seems to be on track, even a little ahead of schedule. That's the follow-on carrier to the Ford. But they do have a lot of things in the air at the moment. The Columbia class is going to start working its way into the system. It's supposed to start construction, full construction this year, this fiscal year. And that's a do-or-die program for the Navy. They say they have no margin for error. They've got issues with the Virginia class. They just signed the Block 5 Virginia class program, which is the largest shipbuilding contract ever signed by the Navy. But there are still sort of technical questions around that. They're starting at a sort of lower level of maturity of design than they necessarily wanted to. It's still very mature, but a little less than they wanted to. So there are questions about whether they can balance this new Block 5 program and Columbia class at the same time and still get Columbia out on its first patrol on time. So yes, there's a lot going on. And then all that aside, we've also got the continuing issues of the aircraft carrier and its relevance, and the air wing on the deck, which doesn't have the range it needs to threaten Chinese targets from outside their anti-access air denial window. So yeah, there's so many things that are sort of hovering around the Navy that the incoming SecNav will have to deal with. And there's a lot of continuing sort of cultural issues as well.
One of those is the force structure assessment for the Navy. They're trying to figure out how many ships they need, where they need them, that kind of thing. That's kind of been a nebulous thing that we were hoping might come out eventually soon, but obviously a new secretary is going to want to put his stamp on something that's not even out. So you see that delaying into 20, or late into 20, into 21?
A cynic might say that delaying was always the plan. So they are certainly serious about this move that has been much hailed to go towards naval integration, which is this idea that's really being pushed by the Marine Corps and being embraced by new CNO Gilday to make sure that the U.S. Marine Corps is fully integrated at every level with the United States Navy, and so that when you're talking about the Navy, you're not just talking about the ships, you're also talking about the Marines that we can deliver, and that being part of the sort of the force package in a way that it hasn't been necessarily thought of in the past. So they're serious about that. If you look at when these big changes, this integrated force structure assessment that's going to take into account the Marine Corps and what their needs are and sort of meld them with the Navy's, the last time they had a big change was the 355 change, and lo and behold, it came out right after Trump was elected. So a cynic might suggest that they may want to see the outcome of the 2020 presidential election before they commit to a massive change. But if you're not cynical, yeah, so probably having a new SecNav, getting his feet wet and getting his arms around the service, that might take some time to work itself through the system before they want to release a big thing like a force structure assessment.
And finally, Dave, as we wrap, looking at, you have the opportunity for 2 new leaders coming in, both of whom were not really expected 6 months ago even to be the leaders of the Navy,
Sure.
so to speak. Does that give them a little bit of a clean slate to start at, or are they facing a very uphill climb to make changes?
So I think, yes, there's a degree of clean slate. I think it'll be interesting to see if the Undersecretary, Thomas Modly, sticks around. I think he probably would like to. But for the most part, yes, it's a clean slate. We'll have completely new leadership. It probably gives Gilday a little more leverage to put his stamp on his tenure with a new secretary. But all the problems that were existing in the Navy before, from what we discussed earlier with the flight deck and the air wing, to the sort of the increasing problems with submarine building in terms of meeting their schedules and a supplier base under strain, all that's still there. And certainly the cultural issues. You've seen drug usage on big decks. You've seen major sort of stories coming out of our sister publication, Navy Times, about drug usage on submarines, drug usage on big decks. You've seen these war crimes trials coming out of the SEAL community and drug usage in the SEAL community as well. And so you're seeing a lot of sort of cultural issues that I think leadership will probably want to get their arms around and figure out a way, whether that's just the way they message the force, or maybe there's in such a way that to groom leadership to understand the kinds of things they need to be looking for and the kinds of things that need to be addressed. So sure, they definitely have an opportunity to make some, to make a fresh start with new leadership, but they really do have to get their arms around some of the cultural issues we're seeing.
All right, thanks, Dave, for the time. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Now, coming up, we're going to preview this year's Reagan Defense Forum and the reason why I'm here in California in the first place. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack offers her latest tips.
According to Edmunds, December is when car dealers offer the highest discounts on car prices. While it doesn't mean you should wait all year to buy a car if you need one, it does mean there are deals to be had if you can wait until the end of the year. According to TrueCar, you can save up to 8.3% off the price of a new car just by shopping on New Year's Eve. But if you're in the market at any other time, you can still maximize your savings by going with the current year's model of the car you want instead of the newer one. And most of the time, there isn't a huge difference between the two. So take advantage of the fact that dealers are trying to clear out the current year's model to make room for the next. It's also a great opportunity to negotiate the price. And don't forget, when you're negotiating, it never hurts to ask if the car maker offers a military discount. If you're looking for a used car, an auto buying service can help with finding the best one for your money. Once you find the car you want, talk to your bank or credit union. You might even be able to get pre-approved, which gives you all the power at the dealership. Armed with these tips, you'll be well prepared to buy a car and save big.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our Early Bird Brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And coming up, we're going to preview the Reagan National Defense Forum and what defense news is doing here in California. This upcoming weekend is the 2019 Reagan National Defense Forum, which is one of the top national security events of the year. To preview it and an event Defense News is hosting here in California, I sat down with Jill Itoro before we left DC. Take a look. Jill, thanks for chatting with me here today. So we've got a busy week that we've got ahead of us with everything going on with both the Reagan Forum and then with the roundtable we're doing through. So walk me through what we've got on tap.
Yeah, so every year, Defense News, of course, goes to the Reagan Defense Forum out in Simi Valley. This year is no exception. A couple of the big topics that I think reverberate and I think that we're going to really be focusing on is innovation. It's in and around Silicon Valley. So it's appropriate that there's a bit of a focus on that effort that is constantly happening by the Pentagon to link up more with the tech community. We did, you remember well, a roundtable last year where we looked at a bit of that cultural clash between the traditional Silicon Valley company and DoD and how they develop software differently and so forth. This year, we're doing another roundtable and looking instead at kind of the economic factors, how the tech community relies on venture capitalists, angel investors to really kind of invest in the big ideas. And DoD doesn't necessarily meld well with that model because it's about really kind of getting a return fast, and we know that never happens in DoD. So we're going to be looking at that to see if we can even come up with some brainstorming ideas, talking to the tech community with DoD and so forth. And at the same time, Reagan is actually doing a panel on that topic as well, which will be great because they also recognize this as a priority area. So that's just one of the areas that we're looking at.
So it's been a year since we last really kind of discussed what change have you seen in that year?
So if you look at staying with innovation, I think has been an understanding that a lot needs to change in how DoD buys, how DoD develops. And so now the conversation is shifting where everyone's a little sick of talking about why these two groups can't get along and can't get on the same page. And now it's more a matter of, okay, what can we do on both sides? What can the tech community do to kind of evolve and move forward? What can the Pentagon do to make it easier to draw that talent in? Looking more broadly at Reagan, of course, I think we'll have also a bit of an evolution in discussion. China is going to remain a huge topic of conversation as it was last year. But I think we're moving on from, competing on technology to looking at, the way that the U.S. functions and develops its own capabilities and leveraging what we are capable of doing rather than just looking at, China is a totalitarian government that can kind of force development to support the military. We're now looking at, how can we take advantage of our allies and so forth to really kind of leverage the capabilities we have through ourselves and NATO.
And just looking at the forum itself, packed lineup, one current, two former Secretary of Defenses on the schedule, National Security Advisor, all four service chiefs. Reagan just seems to be getting bigger and bigger every year. What's your take on the evolution of the event?
It does. I think part of it, this year is particularly big. I remember last year we felt like there wasn't much international presence. It seems that there's a little bit more international presence this year.
Panel this year.
Yeah, an entire panel that actually last year they had one without any international representation. This year they do.
That was pretty entertaining last year.
I think part of the reason is that we're at a bit of a crossroads. We have elections happening in 2020, which is going to be key in the U.S., important elections happening, as we speak over in Europe. The budget is still in a bit of this crossroads, as it somewhat always is, but there's a lot of uncertainties now. The relationship with allies, the U.S. and allies, is still also a bit complex. So there's a lot to talk about, for lack of a better word. And you have to keep in mind, too, we're on our way to Reagan, but right now there is the NATO meeting in London where you have many of our allies sitting down and talking about 2020 priorities for NATO. So, it seems globally to be a time frame where there's a lot of decisions to be made and a lot of evolution in terms of priorities.
So lot's been happening. The 7-day span is going to be incredibly busy and a lot going on. And finally, is there one thing you're kind of most looking forward to about this year's Reagan Forum beyond the view we get out the balcony?
The view may be a little different after the fires. So what last year it was as well. But in terms of looking forward, I think my favorite part of Reagan is there are certain events throughout the year where you feel like leadership, whether it be industry, whether it be defense, is a little more at ease and seems to have their guards down, even around reporters like us. So it's a nice opportunity to just have really very candid conversations, to intermingle with our peers, and it's one of those rare opportunities that I always look forward to. So I'm sure it'll be that again.
We're gonna have a good time. Thanks for the time,
You
Jill.
will.
I appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Jeff.
Now that's all we've got time for this week. But if you want to see and read more, Be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.